Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. Imagine you're walking into a converted brothel in 1870s New York City.
Right in the thick of it.
Exactly. So at the front of this room, standing behind this makeshift pulpit, is this hardened ex-convict. I mean, a guy who just spent 7 agonizing years in the notorious Sing Sing penitentiary.
Yeah, not a soft place.
Not at all. And then, sitting right there in the front row wearing these immaculate tailored clothes is one of the wealthiest society elites in America. And the ex-con looks at this billionaire, doesn't even blink, and tells him to get on the floor and repent.
It's wild. It's just a completely wild scene to picture.
It really is. And today we're doing a deep dive into how audacious, disruptive moments, exactly like that one, well, how they forged an entirely new approach to urban poverty. We're tracing the really deep, multi-layered history of the Association of Gospel Rescue Missions.
Which is, a movement that essentially invented the modern concept of the rescue mission. It's a remarkable trajectory, really, because we're looking at a narrative that begins with soot-covered children in the industrial smog of 1830 Scotland.
Wow. Yeah, going way back.
Yeah. And then it scales all the way to this highly sophisticated global network that's, navigating the complexities of 21st century economic collapses. But I think what makes this deep dive so compelling is the friction.
The friction. What do you mean by that?
Well, the people who built this, from street brawlers to teenage farm girls to high society philanthropists, they were constantly clashing with the established norms of their eras.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, they weren't just handing out soup, right? They were fundamentally challenging how society and, frankly, how the church viewed the most marginalized people in the modern metropolis.
And that is actually the perfect place to start. Let's wind the clock back to the 1830s. We need to look at what we can probably call the Scottish blueprint.
Okay, I like that. The Scottish blueprint.
Yeah, because this is long before any organized association existed in America. We're in Glasgow, Scotland, right in the teeth of the Industrial Revolution.
And things were grim.
Extremely grim.
Yeah.
We have this figure, David Naismith, who looks at the extreme poverty and overcrowding of Glasgow and decides, well, he's going to start the Glasgow City Mission.
Right.
Now, typically in this era, you have churches preaching theology on Sundays and maybe, some disparate almsgiving happening elsewhere. But Naismith creates this interdenominational lay movement that merges the two.
Yeah, and to understand the gravity of what Naismith actually did, you really have to understand the theological and sociological landscape of 19th century Calvinist Scotland.
Which was, I'm assuming, pretty rigid.
Oh, incredibly rigid. There was this very distinct, heavily guarded wall between evangelism and charity.
Really? Like they actively kept them separate?
Absolutely. The prevailing thought was that true spiritual work was exclusively the domain of ordained clergy. A guy preaching from a pulpit.
Right.
Almsgiving, on the other hand, was often viewed with this intense suspicion. It was heavily weighed down by these ideas of the deserving versus the undeserving poor.
Oh, yeah, we still see echoes of that today, honestly.
We really do. Back then, giving a starving man bread without first ensuring his moral fortitude, well, it was seen by many as literally enabling vice.
That is just...
It's harsh, but Naismith completely obliterates that wall. He pioneers this whole person methodology.
The whole person. I like that.
Yeah, he argued that you basically cannot preach spiritual salvation to a man whose physical body is dying of exposure.
Which makes perfect sense.
It does to us. But it was radical then. He saw that the physical destitution and the spiritual void were intrinsically linked, so the intervention had to address both simultaneously.
Okay, but wait. Let me challenge that premise for a second, just playing devil's advocate here based on the source material.
Go for it.
If Naismith is operating in 1830s Glasgow, where the immediate desperate threat is literal starvation and freezing in the streets, how does he justify allocating resources to things like education? Because I know he started evening literacy classes for adults, which sounds noble, sure. But isn't teaching an impoverished, starving person how to read like a massive misallocation of resources?
You mean compared to just buying more food?
Exactly. Why open a school when these people urgently need bread and coal?
And that is exactly the pushback he faced from his contemporaries. It seems totally counterintuitive if you only view poverty as this acute, momentary lack of calories.
Right.
But Naismith understood that the industrial machine of Glasgow was fundamentally predatory. It relied entirely on a massive, uneducated, and therefore highly compliant underclass.
So keeping them illiterate kept them trapped.
Exactly. If you only hand out bread, you keep the man alive for one more day in the exact same subjugated state. By opening evening literacy classes, Naismith was actively handing the marginalized the tools for upward mobility. He was giving them the agency to read the Bible for themselves, yes, but also to read labor contracts, to understand the economy, to navigate society. He wasn't just managing their poverty, he was attempting to break the cycle.
That is profound. And that philosophy becomes glaringly obvious when you look at one of his most fascinating innovations, which were the chimney sweep schools.
Oh, yes, the chimney sweep schools.
Yeah, let's unpack that because it sounds almost Dickensian.
It really does. But they are perhaps the purest early example of what we now call adaptive social work.
Okay, how so?
Well, in that era, impoverished children were forced into brutal labor. They were quite literally sent up suffocating chimneys.
Which is horrifying.
Completely.
Well.
Now, the standard civic approach to education back then was entirely rigid. A school is a building. It's open from morning to afternoon. And if you want to learn, you come to the building.
But a working class child couldn't possibly attend that. They're working.
Exactly. Naismith realized the institution of the school was fundamentally inaccessible to the people who needed it most. So he adapted the institution to the margins.
Wow. So he changed the rules of how a school operates.
He held these classes at night. He specifically tailored them to the horrific schedules of these child laborers. He brought the intervention right to the point of need rather than demanding the broken individual conform to the institution.
That's brilliant. So Naismith builds this incredible intellectual and theological blueprint in Scotland. This idea that you meet the physical need to reach the spiritual person, and you adapt the institution to the street.
Right.
But as we know, intellectual frameworks don't just survive the gritty reality of the American slums on their own.
No, they certainly do not.
Right. If this movement was going to cross the Atlantic and actually take root in the most unforgiving environments of the United States, it needed someone who actually spoke the language of the streets. It needed a brawler.
It needed Jerry Macaulay.
Let's talk about Macaulay. Because you honestly cannot invent a character with a more chaotic, turbulent background.
You really can't.
We're moving to New York City now, specifically the Lower East Side, which in the mid-19th century was notoriously brutal.
Yeah, the 5 Points neighborhood.
Exactly. So Macaulay is an Irish immigrant. He grows up in complete squalor. And he doesn't become this noble, hardworking citizen. He becomes a highly feared ruffian, a thief, and a severe addict.
He was entirely a product of his environment, really. The Lower East Side, and particularly 5 Points, was essentially a stateless zone of vice and disease.
A stateless zone. That paints a picture.
Yeah, and in Macaulay's early life is just this rapid descent into the criminal underworld. He was a prize fighter, a river thief, and he eventually gets caught. And
he gets sentenced to 7 years in Sing Sing.
Right. And we really need to contextualize what Sing Sing was in the 1860s.
Because it wasn't just a normal prison.
Not at all. It wasn't a modern correctional facility. It operated on what was called the Auburn system.
The Auburn system?
Yeah, which was specifically designed to psychologically and physically break a human being. It demanded absolute silence at all times.
Wait, absolute silence always?
Always. Inmates performed brutal hard labor during the day and were locked in these tiny, damp stone boxes at night. The goal was to crush the individual spirit entirely.
God, that sounds like literal torture.
It was.
And it's in that specific environment, a place designed to crush the spirit, that Macaulay actually experiences his initial spiritual awakening.
Right.
But what really fascinates me is the mechanism of that awakening. Because it wasn't some polished prison chaplain delivering a highly educated sermon that got through to him.
No, it definitely wasn't.
It was a message from a man named Orville Gardner.
Yes. And the identity of Orville Gardner is like the key to the entire psychological breakthrough.
Unpack that for us.
Well, Gardner wasn't a detached clergyman. He was a former river thief and a bare-knuckle boxer. He was literally Macaulay's former partner in crime.
No way. His actual partner in crime.
Yes. Gardner had experienced his own religious conversion and started preaching. So when Macaulay, sitting in the absolute despair of Sing Sing, hears that Orville Gardner...
A guy just as violent and cynical as he is.
Exactly. When he hears that this guy has found redemption, it shatters his worldview. A chaplain telling Macaulay to repent, That would bounce right off his hardened exterior.
Yeah, of course. Just another authority figure talking down to him.
Right. But a fellow river thief telling him there is actually a way out, that had undeniable credibility. It penetrated the psychological armor he had built.
It's the ultimate insider validation.
It really is.
But to the historical record's credit, it doesn't paint this as some simple fairy tale.
Oh, no.
When Macaulay is released from Sing Sing, he doesn't immediately march out and start a global charity. He completely relapses.
He does. And honestly, this is vital to understand the empathy he later possessed. He gets out of prison carrying the heavy stigma of a convict, returning to the exact same destitute environment of the Lower East Side.
Surrounded by the exact same triggers.
Surrounded by the exact same illicit economies and addictions, the structural pressures of the 5 points pull him right back in. He returns to smuggling and heavy drinking.
Which is heartbreaking, but also incredibly realistic.
Very realistic. But the seed planted by Gardner remained. Eventually, during a deeply emotional prayer meeting, the conviction returns. He recommits his life to his faith, and this time, the foundation holds.
Wow.
And he begins to preach right there in the very saloons and alleys where he used to brawl.
And he doesn't do it alone. That's a crucial part of the story. He marries Maria Fahey.
Yes, Maria.
And Maria's background is just as vital to their operational success. She was his former girlfriend from his criminal days, a former prostitute whose own faith was ignited by watching the impossible transformation in Jerry.
Maria Fahey is a towering figure in this early movement, the specific demographic she ministered to.
The women in the brothels and dance halls.
Exactly. Those women and girls were trapped in the Gilded Age, entirely cut off from respectable society. A traditional churchwoman from uptown Manhattan could never walk into a 5 Points brothel and command respect or trust.
They'd be laughed out of the room.
Or worse. But Maria knew the economics of survival in that world. She knew the trauma. When she spoke to those women, she spoke as a peer who had survived the exact same nightmares.
So the two of them, Jerry and Maria, they get backed by this wealthy benefactor named Frederick Hatch. And they take possession of a building at 316 Water Street in October 1872.
A very specific building, too.
Right. They specifically choose a building that used to be a notorious bar and brothel, and they transform it into Helping Hand for Men, which becomes the Water Street Mission.
Which is actually known today as the New York City Rescue Mission.
Oh, wow. Still around.
Yep.
And they established this defining foundational theology. Jerry's stated goal was to bring in the most derelict men of the city and, to use his phrasing, clean them up on the outside, while Jesus cleaned them up on the inside.
That phrase right there is the operationalization of Naismith's blueprint.
The inside-out approach.
Exactly. The outside is the physical reality. It's the lice, the starvation, the frostbite, the withdrawal tremors.
Right.
The inside is the profound spiritual and psychological degradation. The brilliance of Jerry and Maria was their absolute zero-barrier approach.
Meaning they didn't have prerequisites for helping you.
Exactly. They didn't care how drunk you were. They didn't care how violent your history was or how many times you had failed, because they had failed.
They'd been there.
Their entire authority was rooted in their shared brokenness. They proved that profound redemption was possible, not despite their dark pasts, but because their dark pasts gave them the precise experiential language required to reach the unreachable.
You know, I often think of Jerry Macaulay through the lens of a resume.
A resume? How do you mean?
Well, in normal society, right, a 7-year stint in a brutal penitentiary, a history of violent theft, severe alcoholism.
Those are the things that permanently destroy a resume.
Exactly. They disqualify you from any sort of leadership.
Yeah.
But in the upside-down economy of the rescue mission movement, those dark chapters were the exact requisite qualifications.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. If he hadn't spent those years in the silence of Sing Sing, he wouldn't have had the necessary gravity to be the evangelist of the slums.
Which was the title he earned.
And he actually contracted tuberculosis in that prison, which eventually killed him in 1884. Meaning he literally poured out his physical life for this specific calling.
He did. And the success of the Water Street Mission was so undeniable, so viscerally effective, that it naturally triggered a massive wave of replication.
People wanted to copy it.
Exactly. People saw what Jerry and Maria were doing and said, we need this in Chicago, we need this in Boston, we need this in Philadelphia. But as you know, replication without infrastructure leads directly to our next major era.
Right, because when you have a highly localized, personality-driven success like Macaulay's, and suddenly hundreds of well-meaning but completely unorganized people try to copy it across a massive continent,
it breeds absolute chaos.
It really does. Which brings us to the late 1800s and early 1900s, an era we can best describe as the Wild West of missions.
Wild West is the perfect term. The rescue mission model was spreading rapidly, but there was no central authority. There was no shared theological standard, and there was absolutely no financial oversight.
Which is a recipe for disaster.
Completely. Anyone could basically rent a storefront, paint Gospel Mission on the window, and start operating. And while many were incredibly sincere and effective, the lack of regulation created a massive vulnerability.
And vulnerabilities always get exploited.
Right.
So how exactly were these operations going wrong? Because we aren't just talking about inefficient management here, right? The historical record points to some deeply cynical operations.
Oh, we are talking about active swindles. The Christian public, seeing the genuine good done by places like Water Street, was very eager to donate.
Naturally.
Predators realized this. You had instances of self-appointed mission directors running completely fabricated operations just to pocket the donor money.
Just total scams.
Total scams. You also had what the records call extremist-run or fad-driven missions.
Fad-driven, like what?
These were highly charismatic individuals operating with bizarre, cult-like dogmas. They used the guise of a rescue mission to prey on vulnerable, destitute people for their own psychological or financial gain.
Wow, so exploiting the people who are already at rock bottom.
Exactly. And this chaos was actively destroying the reputation of the legitimate missions. The public couldn't tell the difference between a real Macaulay-style operation and a scam.
So there's an existential crisis. The legitimate missions realize they need to organize to create some sort of protective umbrella.
Yes.
Initially, there's an attempt called the National Federation of Gospel Missions. And what's crucial here is that this early group included the Salvation Army.
Right, which is a huge detail.
It is,
Yes.
because the Salvation Army is a massive, globally recognized entity today. They had come to the United States from England in the late 1870s. But things between the Gospel Missions and the Salvation Army did not go smoothly.
They didn't. And it's really vital to understand why, because it wasn't just petty infighting over territory. It came down to a fundamental clash of operational DNA.
Walk us through that friction. Because looking back, they seem like they're trying to achieve the exact same goal.
Yeah.
Saving the urban poor. Why couldn't they just operate under the same umbrella? Was it just a branding issue?
It was far deeper than branding. The Salvation Army, which was founded by William Booth in England, had a very specific, highly militarized, top-down administrative structure.
Right, they literally have military ranks.
Exactly. But more importantly, their initial focus was almost exclusively on aggressive open-air preaching and securing spiritual conversions. They were an evangelistic army.
Okay.
According to the historical record, the Salvation Army did not even open physical food and lodging depots in the United States until 1891.
Wait, really? Not until 1891?
Right. And they only adopted that physical rescue model after intensely studying the operations of the independent gospel missions that had been doing it for decades.
Ah. So the sequence of intervention was reversed.
Precisely.
The gospel missions, following the Naismith and Macaulay blueprint, baked the physical rescue, the beds, the soup, the clothing, into their operations from day one. It was the prerequisite for the spiritual intervention.
Yes.
The Salvation Army, initially, led strictly with the spiritual and only bolted the physical depots onto their operations much later.
Exactly. And by the time we get to the early 1900s, you have two incredibly strong, widespread movements.
Well, they operate completely differently.
Right. The Salvation Army has its strict, uniformed, hierarchical structure. The gospel missions are intensely localized, deeply independent, grassroots operations, trying to force these two distinct operational flows and administrative cultures into a single federation.
It was like mixing oil and water.
It was administratively impossible. The gospel missions realized they needed a dedicated organization tailored to their specific reality.
And that realization culminates on September 17th, 1913. The gospel mission leaders gather and officially form the International Union of Gospel Missions, or the IUGM, completely separate from the Salvation Army.
A huge milestone.
They needed a unified voice, a shared standard of effectiveness, and most importantly, a recognizable seal of approval, so the public knew which operations were legitimate.
Yes, it was a massive step toward institutional maturity. But as you mentioned at the top of our discussion, the creation of this new formalized union required leadership.
Right.
And the person they selected to lead this gritty, street-level movement is honestly one of the most fascinating plot twists in this entire history.
It really is, because you would assume the first president of the IUGM would be someone cut from the exact same cloth as Jerry Macaulay, right? a hardened, reformed street brawler.
That would make the most sense.
But instead, the man who conceives of the IUGM and becomes its first president is Mr. Sidney Whitmore.
Sidney Whitmore.
And Sidney Whitmore is the absolute antithesis of the Lower East Side. He is a prominent, incredibly wealthy, highly refined gentleman from high society New York.
But true aristocrat.
Right. He sits on the boards of elite Presbyterian and Reformed churches. So how on earth does a Gilded Age billionaire become the driving force behind a union of impoverished street missions?
Well, the catalyst is one specific transformative encounter at the Water Street Mission years prior.
With Jerry McAuley.
Yes. Sidney Whitmore and his wife Emma were the epitome of comfortable, aristocratic American Christianity. They had wealth, social standing, and a very neat, orderly theology.
Very sanitized.
Exactly. And one evening, they decide to take a carriage down to the slums to visit Jerry McAuley's mission. Their intention, as the historical accounts note, was to help Jerry.
I see where this is going.
Right. They were coming down from the mountain to bestow their benevolent charity upon the wretched poor.
So they walk into this converted brothel, wearing their finery, probably expecting McAuley to fawn over them, right?
Yeah.
To thank them profusely for their presence and their potential donations.
Absolutely. And Jerry completely flips the script.
He shatters their entire paradigm.
He does. Jerry McAuley, a man who survived the horrors of Sing Sing, is not intimidated by wealth. He looks at this refined couple and calls them kid glove Christians.
Kid glove Christians, that's such a burn.
It is. And he tells them flat out that they need another dip.
Okay, we have to pause and explain that terminology because it's so specific to the 19th century revivalist movement.
Yeah, it sounds a bit strange today.
Right. What does Jerry mean when he tells a wealthy benefactor they need another dip, and why does he demand they come to the penitent form?
Okay, so in the theology of the 19th century holiness and revival movements, the penitent form was literally a wooden bench or an altar at the front of the room. It was the place of public surrender.
Like an altar call.
Exactly. If you went to the penitent form, you were admitting absolute moral bankruptcy and crying out for salvation.
Need another dip?
Another dip is slang referring to a secondary spiritual cleansing. Jerry is looking at the Whitmores and identifying that their religion is entirely external. It's just a polite social club.
Right. They check the boxes on Sunday.
Yes. He is telling them that despite their massive bank accounts and pristine reputations, they are just as spiritually bankrupt as the alcoholic dying in the gutter outside.
Wow.
He demands they get on the floor at the penitent form and seek genuine, transformative grace.
I cannot get over the sheer audacity of McAuley in that moment. It is a staggering subversion of power dynamics.
There really is.
It's the equivalent of a frontline social worker today looking a major philanthropic billionaire in the eye and saying, your money is useless here. Your arrogance is the problem. Get on your knees.
It's exactly what it was.
And the even bigger miracle is that the Whitmores actually do it. They don't storm out in offended rage.
No,
they kneel down at that wooden bench and they pray the exact same prayer alongside a destitute, trembling drunkard. God be merciful to me, a sinner.
And that moment is the ultimate sociological bridge. You have to remember, the Gilded Age in New York was a time of unimaginable wealth inequality.
Right, the Vanderbilts and Astors.
Yes. They lived in palatial mansions while immigrants lived in squalid, disease-ridden tenements. Society was violently stratified. But at the altar of the rescue mission, the playing field was completely leveled.
The billionaire and the river thief shared the exact same standing.
Exactly. That profound realization of radical equality is what bound Sidney Whitmore to the mission movement for the rest of his life. He didn't just donate money from afar, he threw his entire life into the organizational structure, eventually founding the IUGM in 1913.
But Sidney dies suddenly, almost immediately after the IUGM is formed.
A huge blow to the movement.
Right. The vice president, John Halliman, steps in for a brief period, but then in 1915, the organization makes a groundbreaking decision. They elect Sidney's widow, Emma Whitmore, to be the president of the entire International Association.
And Emma Whitmore's presidency from 1915 to 1918 is a monumental era.
She wasn't just a figurehead, was she?
Oh, not at all. She is a massive operational force. Following the shared vision she developed with her husband and the McAuleys, Emma recognized the specific, terrifying vulnerabilities of women in poverty.
Which were often overlooked.
Frequently. So she leverages her influence and resources to establish 80 separate homes across the country, specifically designed for fallen women.
80 homes.
Yes, which she names the Door of Hope.
80 homes across the country, managed by a woman in the early 20th century. I mean, that's an administrative triumph.
It's staggering.
And Emma's work at the Door of Hope paves the way for other female trailblazers. The historical record specifically highlights a woman named Clem Ellis White.
Oh, Clem Ellis White. Her narrative is incredible. She represents the shifting demographics of who is drawn to this work.
Right, because she isn't a former convict.
No.
And she's not an aging socialite either.
No, she is a 17-year-old farm girl from upstate New York. She moves to the overwhelming chaos of Manhattan with a very clear, respectable life plan. She is going to teach school and study medicine.
A highly ambitious, secure trajectory.
Exactly. But she becomes friends with the Whitmores and starts volunteering to preach one night a week at a Door of Hope mission.
And the environment completely overtakes her.
It does. The history states she heard the undeniable voice of God calling her to this work. She makes the radical decision to completely abandon her promising medical career.
Wow.
She steps into leadership, taking full charge of the West Side Gospel Mission right in the heart of Manhattan's notoriously rough theater district.
Which was no joke back then.
No joke at all. And we have to strip away our modern sensibilities to really understand how radical this was. In the early 1900s, societal norms heavily dictated what a respectable young woman was allowed to do.
Sure.
Conducting open-air street meetings, preaching loudly on the corners of the theater district to crowds of rough men, drunks, and transients.
That was considered entirely scandalous.
Completely scandalous. But Clem Ellis White completely ignored those societal dictates. Driven by absolute conviction, she claimed her authority on the street.
That is just so bold.
Yes.
So we have this incredible foundational era. Naismith provides the theory, Macaulay provides the street-level proof, and the Whitmores and female trailblazers provide the institutional scale.
Right. They build a robust, fiery movement.
But a movement's true test isn't how it starts, right? It's how it survives massive external shocks.
Absolutely.
And as we move into the middle of the 20th century, the geopolitical and economic tectonic plates of the world shift violently.
They do. And the rescue missions essentially act as a real-time socioeconomic barometer for North America throughout the 20th century.
A barometer. I like that.
Yeah, because when you reach the 1930s and the Great Depression hits, the acute need scales to unimaginable heights. The missions are pushed to their absolute breaking point.
I could only imagine the lines.
Oh, you have accounts of massive throngs of men standing in municipal unemployment lines all morning, finding no work, and then shuffling directly into the rescue mission lines all afternoon.
Just desperate for a bowl of watery soup and a spot on a floor to sleep.
Exactly. But then, almost overnight, the dynamic flips.
World War II breaks out.
Right. And the lines at the missions evaporate because the entire able-bodied male population is either drafted into the European and Pacific theaters or absorbed into the hypercharged domestic wartime manufacturing sector.
So the crisis of unemployment practically vanishes.
It does. But it is the era immediately following World War II that presents one of the most fascinating paradoxes in the history of social work.
The post-WWII paradox. Let's dig into that because it's deeply revealing.
It is. The late 1940s and 1950s in North America mark an era of unprecedented, booming economic prosperity.
Right, the middle class explodes, the suburbs are built, industrial output is massive.
Exactly. By all traditional economic metrics, poverty should have been eradicated. And yet the rescue missions suddenly start seeing a new, steady, undeniable wave of individuals lining up at their doors.
If the economy's booming, who on earth is in those lines?
It was the veterans. The men who had stormed beaches and liberated continents were coming home to a wealthy society, but they were slipping entirely through the cracks of that prosperity.
This really gets to the heart of what we call the invisible poor. Why does a veteran, returning as a hero to the richest nation on earth, end up destitute in a gospel rescue mission?
Because economic prosperity does not cure complex psychological trauma.
Right.
These men were returning with deep, invisible wounds, what they referred to then as shell shock or battle fatigue, and what we now understand as severe post-traumatic stress disorder.
PTSD.
Yeah. They were trying to self-medicate their trauma with alcohol, and the newly established bureaucratic social safety nets, like the VA,
They weren't equipped for it.
no, they were often unequipped to handle the messy, acute reality of deep psychological breaks and severe addiction. I mean, think about it. A man suffering a PTSD episode who has been drinking heavily for 3 days isn't going to smoothly navigate bureaucratic paperwork for housing assistance.
No, of course not. He falls to the street.
He falls to the street, and the only place that had the zero-barrier immediate entry model required to catch him was the rescue mission.
That makes so much sense. Now, to manage this increasingly complex demographic, the IUGM realizes they cannot just operate as a loose fraternal fellowship anymore.
Right, they need serious professionalization.
So in the late 1940s, they start appointing dedicated field secretaries to travel the country, unify the missions, and enforce standards. They hire men like Peter Cortell, I.L. Eldridge, and in 1948, Reverend Chauncey Beeman as a full-time field secretary.
Some really key figures.
But there's a detail in the historical record regarding these men that I found absolutely staggering.
Oh, I know what you're going to say.
The IUGM hires these men to essentially be national executive organizers, but they are told they have to raise their own financial support to do the job.
It's a stunning logistical reality.
I can't imagine taking a high-level executive job, being tasked with organizing a massive international network of charities, and being told, by the way, your salary from the organization is zero. You have to travel and fundraise your own paycheck.
Right. It vividly illustrates the financial precarity of the movement.
It's wild. Even decades into its existence, at the corporate level, it was operating entirely on faith and localized day-to-day generosity.
It speaks to the absolute financial fragility, yes, but more importantly, it underscores the intense vocational nature of the work. You don't take a job with zero guaranteed salary to climb a corporate ladder.
No, you take it because you view it as a divine calling.
Exactly. And despite that grassroots financial precarity, the movement was undeniable in its cultural footprint.
Oh, for sure. You see this in the historical footnotes.
Yeah, like in 1907, you have photographs of a massive horse-drawn gospel wagon rolling through the streets of Los Angeles, acting as a mobile mission.
A mobile mission?
Yeah.
That's so cool.
And by 1926, the attendees of the IUGM convention are photographed on the lawn of the White House, meeting with President Calvin Coolidge.
Wow.
Yeah. You don't get an audience with the President of the United States unless your movement has become a recognized, vital, load-bearing pillar of the national sexual fabric.
From a converted brothel in the Five Points to the lawn of the White House.
It's a massive leap.
But as the 20th century progresses into its final decades, the rules of the game change again. The traditional rescue mission model, a warm bed, a bowl of soup, and an earnest sermon, was suddenly no longer sufficient.
No, the complexity of the modern world demanded a massive paradigm shift.
And this shift occurs heavily in the 1980s and 1990s, driven by severe macroeconomic changes.
Right. The gap between the haves and the have-nots in North America was widening dramatically.
The manufacturing jobs that previously allowed individuals with minimal education to maintain a stable working-class life were just evaporating.
Evaporating entirely.
Right.
Poverty was no longer just an acute, temporary state of joblessness. It was becoming deeply systemic and entrenched.
So the intervention has to change. You can't just keep a man alive for the night. You have to equip him to survive a fundamentally different economy.
Exactly. The missions realize they have to heavily upgrade their offerings.
So what do?
Well, they start integrating extensive continuing education programs, specialized job training, and even creating their own social enterprises where individuals can learn a trade while in recovery.
That's a huge step up from just handing out soup.
It's night and day. And simultaneously, the vision goes truly global. In 1992, the IUGM links arms with international leaders to form the City Mission World Association, headquartered in Sydney, Australia.
And by 1994, they're hosting a triennial conference in Washington, D.C., pulling in delegates from 34 different nations.
Which proves that the core Naismith and Macaulay model is universally applicable to urban poverty, regardless of the continent.
Right. But internally, the North American organization was undergoing a profound identity crisis. They realized their very name was causing friction.
Yes. On May 31st, 2000, at their 87th annual convention, they make a monumental decision.
They drop the century-old name, the International Union of Gospel Missions, and officially rebrand to the Association of Gospel Rescue Missions, or the AGRM.
Now, changing a legacy brand is incredibly difficult.
Right, you lose 100 years of brand recognition.
But the rationale is purely practical. The word union had to go. In the year 1913, union simply meant a fellowship or an association.
Sure.
But by the year 2000, the cultural connotation of union was exclusively tied to organized labor unions. Strikes, collective bargaining, political lobbying.
Oh, I see. It was actively confusing the public regarding their charitable tax status and their actual mission.
Exactly. But the intentional choice was elevating the word rescue. That became the focal point.
The linguistic shift to rescue is actually deeply philosophical.
How so?
Well, charity or relief implies a passive transaction, right? Like giving a blanket to someone in the cold.
Yeah.
But rescue implies an active, urgent, dynamic intervention.
I like that.
It means jumping into the freezing water to pull someone out. It perfectly captured the ethos they wanted to project into the 21st century.
It really did. Mm-hmm. And under the leadership of executive director Steve Berger and his wife Dolores, the organization really leans into this sophisticated modernization.
Dolores Berger is an important figure here, too.
Oh, absolutely. Notably, she served as the historian and wrote Women Who Changed the Heart of the City.
Ensuring the legacy of leaders like Emma Whitmore and Clem Ellis White wasn't erased.
Yes, very important. But operationally, they push for extreme professionalization. They establish Rescue College, which eventually becomes City Vision College, achieving full degree conferring accreditation in 2006.
Meaning mission workers could get actual accredited degrees in urban ministry and nonprofit management.
Exactly. They also bring a program called Alcoholics Victorious under the association's umbrella.
Okay, we should distinguish Alcoholics Victorious from the broader cultural understanding of recovery.
Good point. Most people are familiar with Alcoholics Anonymous, AA, which utilizes a 12-step model reliant on a generalized higher power, as understood by the individual. Alcoholics Victorious utilizes a similar peer support framework, but it is explicitly, unapologetically Christ-centered.
Which align perfectly with the Rescue Mission's foundational theology, that true psychological and physical liberation from addiction requires specific, transformative spiritual intervention.
Exactly.
You know, the best analogy I can construct for this entire era of the AGRM is that they had to update their operating system.
An operating system. Tell me more.
If you think of a computer, the hardware, the physical mission buildings, the deep theological conviction, the inside-out philosophy of Jerry McCauley, all that hardware remained exactly the same. It was rock solid.
Okay, I'm following.
But the software running on that hardware had to be massively upgraded. You couldn't run a 19th century soup kitchen software program in the year 2005.
Right, it would just crash.
Exactly. You had to install complex job training, accredited college curriculums, and sophisticated addiction psychology to combat the highly evolved viruses of the modern economy. Things like the crack epidemic, systemic housing shortages, and generational poverty.
That analogy holds up perfectly, particularly when you look at the stress tests that software was about to face.
Oh boy. The stress test.
Yeah. By 2005, the AGRM leadership knows the landscape is shifting dangerously. They hire a consulting firm, Chorus, to conduct a massive, exhaustive survey of the entire association.
And what did they find?
They identified 25 significant systemic challenges facing the missions. And honestly, they gathered that data just in time, because just 3 years later, the catastrophic 2008 and 2009 global economic meltdown occurs.
The 2008 crash. I mean, that was an extinction-level event for many nonprofits.
It really was.
The mechanics of it were just brutal for charities. On one hand, massive unemployment and foreclosure spikes meant the lines of people needing immediate rescue mission services doubled or tripled.
The needs skyrocketed.
And on the other hand, the donor base, the middle-class families and small businesses that funded the missions, were suddenly losing their own homes and going bankrupt. Needs skyrocketed exactly as funding evaporated.
It forced the most severe operational reevaluation in the history of the movement. Navigating that terrifying fallout fell to John Ashman, who had taken over leadership.
And what did Ashman do?
Under his tenure, they realized that merely surviving wasn't an option. They had to become hyper-efficient. He expanded member services to offer over 50 distinct operational tools for local missions to survive the economic drought.
50 tools? Wow.
And in 2011, he published the book Invisible Neighbors to forcefully articulate the ongoing crisis to the broader, comfortable church, demanding they pay attention to the streets.
Wake up and look at what's happening outside your door.
Exactly.
And perhaps the most vital development under Ashman was the 2012 launch of the formal Best Practices Initiative.
Best Practices was the final transition from the Wild West.
Long overdue, honestly.
Right. It established rigorous, empirically tested standards for financial transparency, board governance, safety protocols, and psychological care.
It proved definitively that the rescue mission movement had evolved from those ad hoc, sawdust floor storefronts of the 1800s into highly sophisticated, clinically informed, professional urban recovery centers.
It's an incredible journey.
It really is. And yet, as we arrive at the modern day, after all this evolution, from Naismith's chimney sweep night classes to horse-drawn gospel wagons,
From surviving the Great Depression to navigating the 2008 financial crash?
from informal fellowships to fully accredited colleges and best practices, after all of that, the history insists on one unchanging core reality.
It really does. The methodologies, the buildings, and the names constantly shifted to meet the demands of the era, but the primary focus remained entirely, stubbornly static.
The inside-out approach.
Yes, the core conviction is that providing physical relief is necessary, but true, permanent transformation of a broken human life requires addressing the spiritual void. The inside-and-out approach that Jerry McAuley shouted from the pulpit of a converted brothel in 1872 is the exact same approach operating in modern, multi-million-dollar recovery facilities today.
The belief in the miraculous power of redemption never wavered.
Never.
It is a remarkable, unbroken through line of human grit and faith. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to pivot and leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to consider as you look at your own city today.
Think deeply about the mechanics of how we treat the marginalized in our current era. Today, our civic social safety nets are heavily sterilized. They are driven by algorithms, massive bureaucratic policies, and rigid metrics of efficiency.
Right.
And while those systems are necessary for scale, we have to ask, what is the unique, irreplaceable value of the grassroots, heavily personalized, fiercely messy approach pioneered by these early gospel missions?
That's the question.
Can true, lasting human rehabilitation ever be achieved purely through the efficient distribution of civic funds? Or does it fundamentally require the kind of deeply personal, radically equalizing, eye-to-eye human connection that Jerry McAuley and Emma Whitmore practiced? Can a policy love a broken person, or does that always require a person?
That is the essential question, echoing through 2 centuries of urban history. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to keep exploring the history of urban social work, to look closer at the hidden legacy of the streets in your own city, and to remember the incredibly complex people who dedicated their lives to reaching the invisible neighbors among us.